I think one of the most marvelous things about being born a human being as opposed to, say, a goldfish is that we do have individual identities. And I hope I don't offend anyone who keeps goldfish, because let's be honest, goldfish don't have great identities. If your goldfish were to die, or your children's goldfish were to die, and while the kids were at school you bought a new one, they wouldn't know any difference when they came home. Whereas you couldn't do that with cats or dogs, and you certainly couldn't do it with brothers or sisters, even though they might want you to. Yeah. So the whole issue is, as the brain becomes more sophisticated, you shift from the generic imperative, narrow repertoire dictated by the genes of what you do, like with the goldfish, through to much more interaction where you learn rather than just have instinct. And human beings do this more than any other species. We're not particularly strong, we don't run particularly fast, we don't see particularly well, but what we do brilliantly is we learn. And that's why we occupy more ecological niches than any other species on the planet. Now, the way this happens is when you're born with pretty much all your brain cells, but it's the growth of the connections that will account for the growth of the brain after birth. So even if you're a clone, an identical twin, you will have a unique configuration of brain cell connections. And we're starting to understand more now how this happens. And we can look at this even with rodents, with rats and mice. And what they've done is to have genetically identical mice or rats and divide them into two groups. One group in an ordinary standard environment and the others in what's called an enriched environment. This doesn't mean to say the animals are taken off to the Caribbean or anywhere exciting, but rather they're exposed to ladders and wheels and interactive experiences with each other that their counterparts in the standard home cages do not have. And then if you look at the single brain cells of these animals, and that's why you have to do it in animals rather than humans, you can see that the branches from an individual brain cell are actually more extensive than those, and this is not due to genetics, because the genes are the same. What's changed is that by interacting with the environment, by a stimulating environment, the brain cell has grown more branches. Okay? So an enriched environment, interactive environment, makes the brain cell work harder, so it grows more branches. Why is that important? Well, what happens is, if it's all about connections, then you'll appreciate the greater the surface area of a brain cell, the more connections can converge, can come in. So therefore, in animals exposed to an enriched environment, they have a greater proliferation of branches, which enables a brain cell to make more connections. So it's as simple as that. So throughout your life, what's happening is, in the first 2 years, the branches are growing, you're making more and more connections. And because if you're individual, you have individual experiences, no two people, even identical twins, won't have identical experiences. They don't occupy the same point in space and time. You have a unique narrative, a unique trajectory. And it often fascinates me that all human beings for the last 100,000 years, since Homo sapiens has been around, no two brains are the same. No two people have had exactly the same experiences, which is quite remarkable. So you have a unique brain, not just in the world now, but throughout the whole of time, you know, which is an amazing thought. You know, there's never been anyone like you, which is something that I think, you know, is quite awesome, really. Yeah? So these connections are made, but they, not just that, they are constantly updated and refined and changed, because every experience is going to modify slightly. So I don't know how many people remember kaleidoscopes. Perhaps I date myself by talking about kaleidoscopes, where every turn of this cylinder yielded a new pattern. It's a little bit like that. Every moment you're alive yields a new pattern, a new series of connections, which in turn gives you a new type of consciousness. And it's this constant evolution of this consciousness that I call the mind, that's personalized. Yeah? And of course, this means that you're constantly evolving and adapting. Of course, you're most adaptable when you're very young, when you're unconditionally open to everything because you don't have anything with which you evaluate the world. So you start off as a one-way street where you just evaluate it in terms of the senses, and you unconditionally will accept whatever comes in, as the Jesuits themselves acknowledged, as anyone has to look at in madrasas, people chanting, or in yeshivas, people chanting. This is what happens. You're just inputting all the time in an unconditional way. But the more experiences you have, the more you will interpret what comes in terms of what you've experienced already. So you shift from a sensory input of how sweet, how fast, how cold, how bright, to evaluating what does this mean to me. And so we shift from noticing something not because they are noisy or bright or fast, but simply because they're your mother. And so you switch from senses to cognition. Doesn't mean to say that very extreme senses don't get your attention. Of course they do. But we start to then live in a world that we're evaluating in much more subtle ways, much more personal ways, much less obvious ways, more cognitive ways, which gives your unique take on the world. And that is constantly updated and changing. So all human beings in those first few years are most impressionable. But of course, we all know of post-traumatic stress syndrome and of searing experiences, sadly some of them very negative, but sometimes very positive ones, that literally change the whole way you see the world. It's fascinating and understudied at the moment, this notion of belief systems with the brain. We take the notion of a belief system for granted, but if you think about it, it's very odd. It's something that's formed in the absence of evidence and formed in such a robust way that it actually will trump evidence. So if we take sexism or racism, how people with those beliefs can hold them very strongly in the face of all evidence to the contrary. Now, where do they come from, these ideas? And what makes them, in brain terms, so strongly embedded? And something else that fascinates me is, can we have a kind of taxonomy of beliefs, and can they be swapped around? So a placebo belief, for example, that the sugar pill will make you better, a sexist or racist belief, therefore a non-religious belief, or indeed a religious belief. Can these things be swapped around? Could a religious belief act as a placebo, for example? These are things that we're only just starting to grapple with, but they fascinate me hugely, how they formed. And I think that the more we understand about belief systems, the more obviously we'll understand the society in which we live. And we'll also understand why if I whisper in your ear, you failed the exam, suddenly you'll have a load of physiological responses and a gut feeling and a strong emotional response to a few words. We take again that for granted, but an emotional response just to a few words actually is quite interesting as well. At the moment, we don't know how belief systems are laid down, but if we think about how one makes connections, which is repetition and constant exposure, then I think it's no coincidence that the madrasa or the yeshiva or the chanting that characterizes so much of so many cultures could be a way of enforcing those connections. There's some wonderful work by an anthropologist in Oxford called Harvey Whitehouse who's explored this. And the reason I like his work is he talks in words that neuroscientists can understand. And he says religious beliefs, at least, can be laid down manipulating two factors, either high arousal but low frequency, or high frequency but low arousal. So the chanting would be the high frequency, low arousal, but that can get a little bit boring, let's say, even for people that believe in this, and if there's no distraction. So by having rituals, by having occasionally the Paul of Tarsus experience, that actually is a low frequency but high arousal event that sticks in your mind and makes you very excited. Now, the reason I like this is arousal and frequency are words I, as a neuroscientist, can map onto the brain. I know exactly what arousal is in brain terms, and obviously frequency speaks for itself in terms of stimulation. So what I would like to develop using Harvey's work is theories or ideas as to how, by manipulating the environment with these two factors, arousal and frequency, one might actually be influencing the connections at different times, and in turn, how that translates into the development of a belief system. For me, the secret of identity in the 21st century is to have this portfolio of no one, someone, anyone, and eureka. One idea is that a narrative could emerge to which we all belong, that we're all part of the internet, we are nodes in some global thinking machine, if you like. This is an idea developed over 200 years ago by a Jesuit priest called Chardin, who coined the phrase the Noosphere. And this was the idea that there'd be, in the final evolution of humanity, this grand kind of central thinking process of which you were just a part. I think we're already seeing it in a way, in that when one communicates on the web, who's having the idea, and where is that idea in cyberspace? And if you're having an ongoing dialogue, whose idea is it? Now, ongoing dialogues, of course, have been going since Socrates, so it's not as if this is new, but I think it's becoming much more universal. It's much larger groups of people are having ideas that are shared and therefore can't be owned by any one individual. On the one hand, that's very exciting. On the other hand, I think it will challenge, perhaps eventually, our view of the individual and what an individual is, because that firewall of the brain and body is already being challenged by nanotechnology. And the firewall of the cyber world and reality is already being challenged. But finally, the firewall of your brain, of where you as an individual can claim credit as opposed to someone else, and how you are different as a person from someone else. Perhaps in the future, perhaps not your children, but your grandchildren might actually feel very differently about their identity and how porous it is with the outside world compared to us, who all think of ourselves as very sealed little systems, little units.